Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at Thena's upgrades, reworks, changes that she got with the mid-month patch, as well as testing what kind of content she might excel in. I know the video review is a little bit late, so I did some extra testing in Dimension Rifts to see how she stacks up there with some of the best characters like Loki, as well as taking her into Dispatch to see if she can tie any of the current characters there, or possibly even do better than them. I didn't just stop at testing Thena in Dispatch, I also tested a bunch of the new characters as well as the various builds that I got or upgraded with the Black Friday event that passed to see if I have any new teams that actually outperform the current one that I had a while ago, which I believe was ABX Leadership with her holiday uniform, as well as Loki and Quicksilver with his summer uniform on the team. So if you're interested in that, especially with the crafting event going on, and you want to get the most ideal or quickest clear time on Dispatch to stack up those snowmen and try for the brilliant or the mighty CTPs, or possibly even just the boxes if that's what you want to do, then make sure to check that out near the end of the video. Sadly, one thing I can't show is the actual time improvement on stage 25 of Knull, since I upgraded my cards from 16% Pierce up to 22 between the time that Thena was released and the time that she was buffed. If you're curious to know how much her clear time improved pre-buff and post-buff, depending on the stuff that I've seen online and guessing with my clear time or the time that I got to the halfway mark for stage 29 Knull, including my 6% Pierce, I would say that the improvement is at the very base minimum a 30-second improvement. This is a little bit of a rough guess, so just take that with a grain of salt, but at the very base minimum it should be around 30 seconds. It could possibly be closer to 45 seconds or possibly even more. One thing that I want to touch upon though is that her rotation has actually changed pretty significantly with the mid-month patch. The ultimate especially got, I think, about 100 to 150% extra damage on it, or on a single skill, which will directly apply to the ultimate skill. So before, you kind of wanted to cancel it because there was no buff on it, so you could just go back into your rotation while you've stacked up the ultimate on top of the other skills that you're casting. But now that it has that buff on it, you actually do not want to cancel the ultimate skill because it does a lot of damage. The rotation that I previously mentioned that I was doing was 3, cancel 2, cancel 4, cancel 5, or some slight variation of that. But now, after playing her a little bit more and seeing that the third skill hits a lot harder, and that you can cancel the fifth skill, and that the second part of the fifth skill, where she kind of twirls the spear above her, doesn't really do that much damage, the new rotation that I'm currently using for her is instead starting off with 2, cancel 4, cancel 5, cancel 3. So you basically want to stay in the third skill because the second part of that hit on the third skill does more damage than that of the second part of the fifth skill. So again, the new rotation that I'm currently using is 2, cancel 4, cancel 5, and then finish with the third skill and let that play through. Once that's finished, you can also go into the first skill while you're waiting for the other skills to come back off cooldown. You might be thinking that you want to open with the third skill because it has that damage accumulation on it, but I did test it quite a bit, and this ended up being the most consistent and better damage than the other way, which was using the 3 first and then doing the 2, 4, and 5. I will add though that this new rotation is good for bosses, but if you're fighting enemies, just regular enemies in something like a Dispatch or a Dimension Rift, you can still use the rotation 3, 2, 4, and 5, and it actually is a little bit better there because the 3 groups up the enemies in the beginning. So just to give you an idea of how much of a difference the rotation makes, and if you cancel the ultimate versus not canceling the ultimate, the first clear that I did of Knull, stage 29, I finished with 1 minute and 46 seconds remaining with her newest buff, Before I show you how much better the rotation and not canceling the ultimate is in terms of the clear time, the rotation that you want to use when using the ultimate now is 2, cancel 4, cancel 5, cancel 3, and then go into your ultimate. So it's the new rotation that I mentioned just a few seconds ago, but you cancel 3 at the end and then just stay in your 6th skill or your ultimate skill. So by using this rotation and not canceling the ultimate, which I'm reiterating is crazy damage, I finished the same stage with no other changes, a full minute faster at 2 minutes and 47 seconds remaining. Since ABX isn't really affected by pierce damage that much, the 6% that I got on my cards doesn't really matter, so it will give you a better idea of her improvement in this mode. Previously, I scored 7.8 million with the same team that you see here, so for the Universal Female Hero Day. And then with the mid-month buff upgrade, I got 8.3 million using the same rotation. But if you are to use the new rotation that I mentioned, I actually did better than that. So again, with no other changes besides the rotation that was used and not canceling the ultimate, my score improved by another 400,000 points, and if you compare her performance to before her buff, which was 7.8 million, to after her buff, which was 8.7 million, it's essentially a 1,000,000 point increase, which is a pretty substantial improvement to the character. So this kind of improvement means that if you want to use her as a leadership in something like Danger Room Extreme, you also have the benefit of her being one of the best standalone characters as a leadership, meaning that you don't have to feel like you're just picking a character as a support for another main damage dealer. You can do a lot of damage yourself with the character. I didn't mention it in the World Boss Legend clears that I did, but the fact that they listened and added a heal to her kit is pivotal, since she can push high stages of World Boss Legend where you don't really get healing because of the restrictions to your strikers, and because she has the heal, she now has even more usability in PvP like Alliance Conquest. I'm obviously showing timeline since I didn't have access to Alliance Conquest at the time, but she does perform better or is more consistent now, even if you are using a CTP of Rage. Main reason for that is because the 5th skill is her highest priority skill, meaning that the AI will use that skill whenever all other skills are available, and because the heal is on the 5th skill, then she benefits from staying alive a lot longer because she has that. So if you went with something like a CTP of Transcendence for PvP, that heal should be even more noticeable because she'll be able to survive when she gets caught out of her iframes and be able to heal back up and reach that halfway mark where she can become invincible or have a shield if you're using something like CTP of Regen. And where she previously couldn't take out the second character in timeline because of her heal, she is able to do that now. But funny enough, you're seeing me fail to the support because of Colossus's Reflect. With the character definitely improved, you might be wondering what purpose she has in your roster. You might not need a character for World Boss Legend, you might not care for Danger Room Extreme, and you might already have other characters like Wanda for ABX. Though I do believe that she currently is the best character for the Universal Hero Female. But if you don't care to push ABX, then you might be left wondering, why build the character? Well, as you might have guessed from the background clip, if you're doing Dimension Rift runs daily and you're trying to go for the highest stages, trying to clear them as fast as possible, I found out that for me, at least, she seems to be the best character to clear it the fastest. I used a bunch of different teams to find out which one was the best for me before I used Thena, and the one that I previously used was White Fox's Leadership, Loki as the main damage dealer, and Valkyrie as the support. With that particular team, I would finish with about a minute remaining, and surprisingly enough, the TVA uniform was actually a little bit slower than the President Loki one, because even with the guaranteed crit on the TVA uniform, the mind control was really helpful for locking down the final boss and clearing it faster that way, and his 5th skill, or rather his 4th skill, on the President Loki uniform kind of pulls enemies together, whereas the fourth skill on the TVA uniform actually kind of spreads them apart. And this makes a pretty big difference, since you can pull enemies that kind of wander away into those static AoE damage fields that are laid out on the map, like the ultimate or the fifth skill. And as I mentioned before, you can lock down the bosses fairly easily to be able to finish them off even faster. Now do keep in mind that I am testing this on manual play since it is stage 6, and even for my account with the 22 Pierce, I don't really want to leave it up to chance and put it on autoplay, since I'm not entirely sure if they'll be able to finish every single time, regardless of whether I'm using Loki as the main damage dealer or if I'm using Thena. But besides that, you do have that 30-minute time limit to get up to those 100 points, and the faster that you clear, which you do want to do, you get those essence for the artifact, which you can use for upgrading or getting more artifacts from the artifact chest. That is considering that you get the MVP. If you don't, then you obviously don't get that essence, but regardless, you spend less time in Dimension Rift, which you can spend in other modes or auto the game or whatever else. Anyways, with that aside, some of the reasons why Thena is so good in things like Dispatch or Dimension Rifts is because most of her skills have a very short cooldown, which means that you can fill up that ult that hits a lot harder now, much more quickly. Besides that, the third skill is really useful for grouping up the enemies so that you can do damage to all of them at once, and the second and fourth skill I believe have all defense down, which isn't really too high, it's around 30%, but with White Fox lead that gets bumped up a little bit higher, which is always useful for clearing faster. So you saw that with the TVA uniform, I finished stage 6 of Dimension Rift with 1 minute and 3 seconds remaining, and then with the President Loki uniform, I finished a little bit faster with 1 minute and 9 seconds remaining. But with Thena, I'm able to finish even faster than that with about 10 to 15 seconds difference compared to Loki. So as it stands currently, of the characters that I tested, she is the fastest on my account for clearing stage 6 of the Dimension Rifts. This might not be the case for you depending on how you've built your own roster, or even if you have Thena and built her up in a specific way, but the purpose of these clips is to show you that she definitely has value for Dimension Rifts, aside from the stuff that I showed before that. This second clip is just to show you her consistency, where I can almost potentially one-shot the boss most of the time, and I usually clear with about 1 minute and 20 seconds remaining with her and the current team that I have set up. So because Thena does well in hard content where enemies are high level, such as Dimension Rifts, which I just showed, it stands to reason that she'll also be good in things like Dispatch. But keep in mind that I was playing that on manual. When you're doing Dispatch, especially if you're passively farming for the crafting event that is currently going on, you generally want to leave it on autoplay, and on autoplay she isn't nearly as good as characters like Loki, which have that high all defense down that lasts for up to 10 seconds and lingers around the map on a large AoE with his fifth skill. That being said, the team that I usually went with for high level Dispatch was White Fox lead, Loki, and Quicksilver. As you can see, the clear time is pretty good with a full 1 minute and 6 seconds remaining. Considering that Thena is pretty good herself and her leadership is damage, I wanted to see if using her instead of White Fox would end up being even better, since Loki doesn't really benefit from White Fox's support, and it just increases his all defense down cap. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, and having Thena as a leadership instead of White Fox didn't really improve the clear time for the team, it actually made it slower, which kind of highlights how important all defense down is in the mode. But despite the clear time being slower, the team was still able to finish the stage with a respectable amount of time, about 45 seconds remaining. So if you don't have that particular White Fox uniform, you can potentially use Thena as leadership. Just keep in mind that it won't be nearly as good, but it should be enough to possibly help you clear certain stages. That said, even though her leadership will give you a slower clear time, the character itself can act as a replacement for other really good characters in Dispatch like Loki or Quicksilver. She might not necessarily be as good as them, but she's very close to it. You can see that replacing Quicksilver with Thena on the team does give me a pretty close clear time to what I had before, but I'm about 10 seconds off, which means that if you don't have Quicksilver built up at all or his latest uniform, then you can potentially use Thena instead. Similarly, you can do the same thing if you want to replace Loki on your roster, and by doing so, I essentially got the exact same clear time as when I replaced Quicksilver. So the fact that she can almost mimic some of the best characters for clearing Dispatch quickly should give you an idea of how much better she is now. This flexibility means that you can try out other teams, again depending on where your roster is, especially ones that can fully benefit from White Fox's support, to leadership characters, or ones that have the leadership tag. You might not necessarily get as good a clear time as with some of the characters that I mentioned like Loki and Quicksilver, but you are able to do it with a respectable amount of time remaining. Here I'm using Sersi with Destruction as an additional support and damage dealer, and I finish about 6 seconds slower than the previous clears that I showed, and roughly about 20 seconds slower than my first clear that was with Loki and Quicksilver. Unrelated to Thena's upgrade, but related to the Asgard Invasion update, I also tested with Sif's new uniform and using a triple support team to see how that would work, but that was slower than the other teams that I tested, so I'm just putting this out there in case you're wondering what kind of clear time this particular team combination would have. Keep in mind that I only have Rage on Sif, an Insight on Valkyrie, and an Authority on White Fox, so if you went with all damage procs for all 3 characters, they could potentially have a pretty decent clear time. Their combat typing probably limits them from having a really good clear time, which is another strength for Thena. Since she's universal type, she doesn't have a damage penalty versus any of the enemies she's facing. Speaking of damage typing, since I'm using White Fox Leadership and Quicksilver, which are both speed types, and stage 10.4 of Dispatch has a blast type villain and mostly blast villain enemies, since I'm using a Reforged Judgment on Rogue, which has that damage type increase even further, and because she has all defense down on her 4th skill that lingers, I used her on the team with Quicksilver and White Fox. And surprisingly enough, I had the most consistent clear times over multiple runs with this team. It's important to note that I also chose characters that would benefit from White Fox's uniform passive, which applies to heroes, which both Rogue and Quicksilver are, but sadly the leadership tag is on neither of those characters, so they don't get to benefit from White Fox's tier 2 passive. But because the final boss is a villain, White Fox does get those benefits herself. Again, the team that you run is really dependent on how you've built your roster, but one particular character that you can use in here that would be really good if you had something like a CTP of Greed, for example, or possibly another damage proc build, would be Daredevil. He has high all defense down that caps around 60% and stacks up quickly, and he also has the leadership tag, which means that he benefits from White Fox's uniform passive and tier 2 passive, and he's a speed type, meaning that if you take him into 10.4, he'll get full benefits versus the final boss there. So those are the changes for Thena. Overall, she got a really great rework, giving her additional survival with that heal on her 5th skill, as well as the much needed damage increase throughout her various skills, including that 3rd skill having higher damage accumulation, as well as the ultimate not only looking cool, but having the damage to match the visuals. Hopefully this video gave you some ideas on how to build Thena and what content you can use her for. I also showed off a bunch of different Dispatch teams that you can potentially use her on, and even ones that don't have her. Next video will likely be on the meta tier list for Alliance Conquest and possibly Timeline as well. As always, if you found the video useful, interesting, or entertaining, please consider sharing it, liking, subscribing, and even clicking that bell notification icon so you know when the next video is up and you don't miss it. If you have questions or comments, you know where to leave them, and if you have a lot of them, then maybe consider joining the Discord so I can take a look there and other people can help you out too. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.